The contract from the law firm had listed the marriage as a business arrangement. Clara Whitfield had read that word 3 times arrangement, because arrangement was a word she'd learned to distrust. Arrangements were what the bank called it when they gave her 90 days to lose everything. And now, arrangement was what a man she'd never met, a man whose last name turned up in Forbes profiles and federal investigations that never quite went anywhere, was calling a marriage. She was 27 years old, standing on the porch of a horse ranch in Montana that was beautiful the way a sinking ship is beautiful, holding a leather envelope delivered by a man in a black suit who had no business being on a dirt road, and she was reading the number at the bottom of the page for the 3rd time because it was exactly, not approximately, not rounded, exactly the amount she owed. Someone had looked into her life down to the last cent and decided she was worth buying, or borrowing. She hadn't figured out which yet. The man who delivered it, a sharp-jawed figure named Cass Brewer who held the envelope the way someone holds a thing he's been told is important but doesn't fully believe in at arm's length, turned slightly sideways, had said only this. "Mr. Valenti will explain the rest himself." She'd asked, "Why me?" And Cass had looked at the ranch, then at her, and said, "It's more complicated than what's on paper." Then he'd gone quiet the way men go quiet when they've said more than they were authorized to and know it. She didn't press him. She'd learned a long time ago that there were 2 kinds of people who held back information, those protecting themselves and those protecting someone else out of loyalty they couldn't quite explain. Cass had the look of the second kind, and that was worth something. Not trust. Not yet. But a data point she could file where it belonged, until she had enough to build a picture. Because Clara Whitfield didn't make decisions on instinct, she made them on patterns. And right now, standing on a porch her mother had painted white 20 years ago, and her father had never repainted, reading a contract that smelled like Italian leather and someone else's certainty, she could feel the first thread of a pattern she didn't yet understand, but intended to. If this story's already pulling you in, hit subscribe and turn on that bell. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you know a woman who's carried more than the world ever knew, tag her, she needs to hear this. Now let's step back onto that porch in Montana, because Clara Whitfield was about to make the most dangerous decision of her life. Cass Brewer backed the black SUV out onto the dirt road, and Clara stood watching until the dust had completely settled before she finally looked back down at the stack of papers in her hand. She sat down on the wooden steps, her back resting against the porch post, and for the first time, she read the entire contract from beginning to end, instead of only looking at the number on the last page. 12 months of legal marriage. The full debt of $387,000, paid within 7 business days after signing. Ownership of the ranch remaining under her name, a monthly allowance. End of contract. A clean divorce. No strings attached. And on the final page, a handwritten line in black ink, slanted but clear. "I need a legal wife. I don't need love. I need someone trustworthy. 48 hours to decide." She set the contract down beside her thigh and looked toward the horse barn. The Montana evening wind pulled across the barn roof, and the leak in the right corner made a small whistling sound every time the wind changed direction. 18 months earlier, her father had lain on the bed in the back bedroom of this house, so thin that his hand looked like paper wrapped around bone, and he had held her hand and said in a voice she had to lean close to hear, "Don't sell the ranch, Clara. Everything I'm leaving you is in there." She had thought he was talking about the summer mornings when she rode horses with her mother before her mother got sick. She had thought he was talking about memories, about roots, about the only thing left of a family that had lost 2/3 of its members. She hadn't thought he was speaking literally. She went inside, placed the leather envelope on the kitchen table, right beside the bank letter she had opened 3 days earlier, the one with the bold printed words, "Final Notice," the one she had read enough times to know every number inside by heart. She opened the laptop on the kitchen table, typed in the name Nico Valenti, and started reading. The first result was a Forbes article from 7 years earlier, a list of 30 people under 40, with a portrait attached. A man younger than she had imagined, dark-eyed, unsmiling, standing in front of a hotel facade whose name she recognized because it was on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. The article called him the chief executive officer of Valenti Holdings, a luxury real estate and hotel corporation, the 3rd generation of an Italian-American business family in Chicago. She scrolled down. The second result was a Chicago Tribune article. Federal investigation targeting Valenti Corporation ends without charges. The third was a shorter piece, a witness withdrawing testimony before a grand jury. The fourth had the Valenti name appearing in a report on organized crime in the Great Lakes region, not as a defendant, but as a related subject. She read each article long enough to understand the picture without needing anyone to draw it for her. Forbes on the front side, the federal government on the back side, and the line between the two so thin it could cut your hand open if you held it the wrong way. She closed the laptop. She looked out the kitchen window. The white fence, now gray after 3 years without paint, the 1997 Ford truck, parked in the yard, that she had to start 3 times that morning before the engine finally caught. And beyond that, the mountains already wearing the first snow of the season on their peaks. 90 days. That was all the bank had given her. 90 days before they took the land her grandfather had bought with a lifetime of savings. The land her father had lived and died on. The land her mother had painted the porch of white, and then never lived long enough to paint a second time. She picked up the phone, opened her contacts, and tapped the number Cass Brewer had left behind. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered, professional, emotionless, the kind of voice belonging to someone paid to answer the phone at 9 o'clock at night. Clara said, "Tell Mr. Valenti that I'll come to Chicago, but I'll sign when I want to, not when he wants me to." She hung up before the other woman could answer, set the phone down on the kitchen table beside the bank letter and the leather envelope, and sat there alone in the quiet kitchen, looking at the 3 things lying side by side on the oak tabletop her mother had bought at a flea market 20 years earlier, and she wondered whether the decision she had just made was brave or desperate, then decided the answer didn't matter as much as the fact that she had made it. Cass Brewer waited for her at the arrivals gate at O'Hare Airport with a small sign bearing her name in printed letters, and that was the only polite thing he showed during the entire drive back to the city center. He took her bag without asking, opened the car door without speaking, and drove the black sedan through streets Clara had never seen in real life before. She sat in the back seat and looked through the car window in silence. Chicago wasn't like anything she had prepared in her mind. Not because she had never seen a big city. She had lived in Bozeman for 4 years while she was in college. But Bozeman was the kind of city where you could still see mountains from any street corner. Chicago wasn't. Chicago was steel and glass and concrete stacked on top of itself until the sky was only a narrow strip between 2 high walls, and people walked along the sidewalk so fast it was as if they were running from something no one was willing to admit. No one looked at anyone. No one nodded hello. In Montana, she drove her truck past a neighbor's house and raised her hand to wave even if that person was half a mile away. Here, 2 people stood 1 foot apart in an elevator and stared straight down at their phones, as if the person beside them didn't exist. The car stopped in front of a glass building in the Gold Coast that Clara recognized because it had appeared in a photo in the Forbes article she had read the night before. Cass brought her into the lobby, nodded to the guard without needing to give a name, and led her to a private elevator at the end of the hallway behind the reception desk. The elevator required a key card. Cass swiped the card without turning back to look at her, and the doors closed without a sound. 47 floors. She counted them on the number panel and said nothing. The elevator doors opened onto a short hallway paved in gray marble, with white walls and soft light from recessed fixtures whose bulbs she couldn't see anywhere. It was so quiet she could hear the soles of her own shoes touching the floor, and that sound echoed back from the walls as if the hallway itself were listening to her walk. There were no family photographs on the walls, no shoes left outside the door, no coat hooks, no sign of any kind that a specific human being lived at the end of this hallway. Only 2 abstract paintings facing each other. The kind of paintings Clara knew were expensive, because they didn't look like anything at all. Cass opened the front door with a code and stepped aside to let her go in first. The penthouse was larger than the entire first floor of her ranch house. High ceilings, glass windows from floor to ceiling looking out over the Chicago skyline, dark wood floors without a single scratch, an open kitchen with a white stone counter. Clara was sure no one had ever used to cook a real meal. The living room had 2 leather chairs, a low glass table, and a bookshelf where the books were arranged by the color of their spines instead of in any order that suggested someone had actually read them. Clean, cold, everything in its proper place. This was a place that was maintained, not lived in. A place someone paid to have cleaned every day, but where no one sat down long enough to make it messy. Clara set her bag on the floor beside the door. She didn't sit down in the leather chair. She didn't go look at the bedroom. She walked straight to the largest glass window and stood there, looking down at the city 47 floors below, where cars as small as fingertips moved along lines she couldn't see, and she didn't think about whether the view was beautiful or not. She was counting exits. The front door she had just come through. The emergency stairs she had seen marked by a sign at the end of the hallway. The elevator that required a keycard she didn't have. She recorded all three in the same place in her mind where she recorded every important thing, and she stood there looking down at Chicago until she heard footsteps behind her, the kind of footsteps that weren't deliberately light but weren't deliberately heavy either, the footsteps of a man who was used to owning every room he entered. She didn't turn around right away. She let those footsteps come close enough for her to hear their rhythm. Steady, unhurried, the rhythm of a man who didn't need to rush because everything in this room belonged to him, and only then did she turn. Nico Valenti looked different from the Forbes photo taken 7 years earlier, not because he had aged, but because that photo had captured a man trying to look like whatever the magazine wanted, while the man standing in front of her now had stopped trying to look like anything at all. 36 years old, black hair cut short, with no gel in it. The kind of haircut a man got because it was neat, not because it was fashionable. His build was lean and solid, not the swollen muscle of someone who trained to show off, but the compressed strength of someone who trained because of discipline, because of habit, because he needed his body to function precisely more than he needed it to look good. Dark gray suit, no tie, shirt sleeves rolled up to the middle of his forearms, revealing a black-faced watch Clara didn't recognize by brand, but knew was expensive because it didn't need anyone to recognize the brand. He didn't come in through the front door where Cass had just brought her. He stepped out from a hallway in the back that she hadn't had time to inspect, which meant he had already been inside this penthouse before her, which meant he had watched her enter, set down her bag, cross the living room without sitting, stand at the glass and count the exits, and he had chosen this moment to appear. Clara understood at once. He had watched her through the security cameras, from the elevator, through the hallway, through the living room. He had given her time not because he was polite, but because he wanted to see what she would do when she thought she was alone, and what she had done was count exits. She wondered what conclusion he had drawn from that. He looked at her, not the look she had prepared herself for on the flight from Montana, the male look that moved from face to chest to hips, and then back to the face, while assigning a number in the mind. This look was different. He looked at her the way someone looked at an equation he hadn't yet decided how to solve. Not because the equation was too difficult, but because he wasn't sure the answer would be the one he wanted. Miss Whitfield. His voice was lower than she had imagined. Not cold, not warm. Flat in a deliberate way. The voice of a man who had trained himself so no one could read anything from the sound he made. Mr. Valenti, she answered in that same flat tone, and she saw something flash through his eyes, so quick she almost missed it. Not surprise. Closer to recognition. As if he had just checked a box in his mind. She didn't tremble. She didn't offer a polite smile. She didn't try to appear comfortable. Sit down. He didn't say it like an invitation. He said it the way someone spoke in a conference room. Brief, without a question at the end. The kind of sentence everyone around him was used to hearing and used to obeying without thinking. Clara didn't sit. I'll sit when I decide to sit. She didn't say it any louder than the sentence before. No emphasis, no challenge. She said it as if it were the most ordinary thing she had said all day. No different from, the weather is nice today, or the coffee is a little strong. And it was that ordinariness that changed the room. Because Clara Whitfield didn't know this, but in this penthouse on the 47th floor, in the conference rooms and restaurants and back rooms of the clubs he owned, very few people said no to Nico Valenti. The people who had said no had said it with trembling voices, or defiant voices, or the calculating voice of someone gambling with something larger than themselves. No one said no in an ordinary voice. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds. Nico tilted his head to the right, just a little. The kind of tilt Clara recognized was not anger. It was the head tilt of someone recalibrating a calculation in his mind. Someone who had entered the wrong variable and was adjusting everything behind it to fit the new data. He had thought she would sit. She hadn't sat, and instead of treating that as a problem, he was treating it as information. Then he pulled out a chair, not the one across from him, but the chair beside his own desk. And he sat down first. No further words, no second invitation. He sat, opened a file on the desk, leaving the distance between them open, and allowing her to remain standing by the window for as long as she needed to feel secure. That was the first time Clara thought that maybe, just maybe, this man wasn't entirely like what Google had shown her the night before in Montana. Clara waited for him to speak first. She had learned long ago that the person who opened their mouth first in a silent room was the one who needed something more, and she wanted to know just how badly Nico Valenti needed her before she let him know anything about herself. He sat at the desk, the file open in front of him but his eyes not on it, watching her as she stood by the glass with the kind of patience that belonged to a man used to waiting longer than the person across from him. Then he spoke. "My father died 2 years ago." He said it in the same flat voice Clara had heard when he told her to sit down. But this time she heard something beneath that flatness, a small crack he had sealed over very carefully, but not carefully enough for her to miss it. Before he died, he signed an internal family agreement. I don't know whether he signed because he trusted someone, or because he was too sick to read closely what he was putting his name on, but that agreement states that if I don't marry before my 37th birthday, financial control of the corporation transfers to the advisory board. He paused. The chairman of the advisory board is Victor Harlan. He has been my family's financial advisor for more than 20 years. My father treated him like a brother. Clara said nothing. She was placing the pieces of information into their proper places in her mind: an inheritance agreement, an advisory board, a man named Harlan whose power depended on the condition that Nico remained unmarried, and Nico, sitting here with a marriage contract, sent all the way to Montana. "My 37th birthday is in a few months," he said. "I need a legal marriage before that date, not a wedding for photographs. A marriage that, when the FBI looks at it, when Harlan's lawyers look at it, when the press looks at it, no one can find a crack. I need a wife with a clean background, untouched by anything from my world, with a real life in a real place, with real work that will make sense to anyone who checks." He looked at her. "I don't need someone beautiful. I need someone real." Clara let that sentence hang in the air just long enough for him to know she was weighing it, not being impressed by it. Then she asked, "How thoroughly did you check me?" Nico didn't dodge. "You studied finance at the University of Montana, completed your bachelor's degree, entered the master's program, then dropped out in your second year to come home and care for your father when he was diagnosed as terminal. You ran the books for your father's horse ranch for 3 years, by yourself, without hiring an outside accountant. You're the only person within 200 miles of that town who can read a balance sheet without needing anyone to explain each line." He stopped, and for the first time, Clara heard his voice change. Not much, only enough for her to know the next sentence wasn't part of the script he had prepared. "But I don't know whether you're brave or desperate. That's the only thing the file doesn't tell me." Clara looked at him and saw something she hadn't expected. Honesty. Not the kind of honesty people used as a tactic, but the kind of honesty belonging to someone tired of calculating every sentence and deciding that, with this particular woman, speaking plainly would work better than speaking in circles. She assessed it with the same system she used to assess everything, not by feeling, but by pattern. Good liars never admitted there was something they didn't know. Nico Valenti had just admitted it. "You'll have to wait and see," she said. Then she walked to the desk, leaving the glass for the first time since she had entered this penthouse. She sat down, not because he had told her to sit, but because she had decided to sit, and she pulled the contract from the file on the desk toward herself. She read it again from the beginning, every clause, every line of small print, every footnote at the bottom of the page. Nico didn't hurry her. He sat there and let her read at her own pace, and Clara recorded that in the same place where she had recorded the way he had sat down first earlier. The box marked, "Things about Nico Valenti Google" didn't tell her. When she finished reading, she took a pen from the holder on his desk, turned to the last page, and added a handwritten line directly beneath his own handwritten words. "I have the right to access all corporate financial records related to this marriage." She signed her name below that line, then turned the contract toward him. Nico read what she had just written. He read it slowly, and Clara knew he was reading slowly not because the sentence was hard to understand, but because he was measuring exactly what she had just asked for. The financial records of a corporation the FBI had once investigated. All of them, related to this marriage, which meant she was giving herself the right to define what related meant. He lifted his eyes to her. He looked at her for a long time. Not the look of an unsolved equation from the beginning. This was the look of a man who had just realized that the equation might be more complicated than he had thought, and he wasn't sure that was bad news. Then, he picked up the pen and signed. The first week in the penthouse on the 47th floor unfolded like the life of two strangers sharing the same hotel, but neither of them had booked the room together. Clara slept in the guest room at the end of the east hallway. Nico slept in the master bedroom on the west side, and between them was a long marble hallway that both of them crossed every day, but never once stopped in to talk. On the first day, Clara woke at 4:45 in the morning, because that was the hour she woke at the ranch to feed the horses, and her body didn't know it was in Chicago. She walked into the kitchen, turned on the light, and saw the coffee pot already full. Hot. She stood looking at that coffee pot for 10 seconds before she understood. Nico Valenti had woken before her. He had been in this kitchen, made coffee, and left before she stepped out of her room. She didn't know whether he had done it out of courtesy, out of habit, or because he wanted to avoid sitting at the breakfast table with a woman he had just signed a marriage contract with, but didn't yet know what to say to. She poured a cup, drank it, and didn't ask. On the second day, she woke 10 minutes earlier. The coffee was still ready. He was still gone. But this time, on the kitchen table, beside the coffee pot, there was a thin file. No note, no explanation. Just a financial file with the Valenti Holdings logo in the left corner, placed neatly at the spot where she would sit if she sat down. Clara sat down. She opened the file and began to read. That was how the first week operated. Every morning she woke up. The coffee was ready. Nico had disappeared, and a new file lay on the table. The third day was the quarterly financial report of a subsidiary specializing in hotels. The fourth day was the investment file for commercial real estate on the south side of Chicago. The fifth day was the summary of the entire corporation's cash flow over the most recent 12 months. He was giving her access slowly, layer by layer, like a man opening one room at a time inside his own house, to see whether she could be trusted before handing her the key to the next room. They saw each other exactly twice a day. In the morning, when he passed through the kitchen and nodded, and in the evening, when she passed his office and nodded. The total number of words they exchanged in the first 7 days could be counted on 2 hands. Morning. Morning. The file's on the table. I saw it. Need anything? Not yet. And that was all. But Clara wasn't reading the files because Nico had placed them there. She was reading because she needed to know where the money used to pay off her ranch debt had come from. $387,000 had been transferred into her bank account within 5 business days after she signed the contract. Exactly as the clause stated, and she wanted to know which compartment of the Valenti empire that stream of money came from, the clean part, or the part the FBI had once wanted to examine. She began tracing it backward, and it was while tracing it backward that she saw something she hadn't been looking for. Cash flow from 3 subsidiaries poured into the same investment fund named Harlan Capital Advisory. That fund had one sole manager, Victor Harlan, but Victor Harlan didn't only manage the fund. He was also the person who signed off on advisory expenses for those very same 3 subsidiaries, which meant he sat on both sides of the table, the side paying the money and the side receiving it, and no one saw the problem because no one was looking at both sides at the same time. Clara looked closer. An advisory fee of $850,000 was recorded at the first subsidiary in the 3rd quarter. The same fee, the same amount, the same quarter, appeared at the 2nd subsidiary. 2 payments for the same service that had only happened once. And the more refined part was this. The money Harlan had withdrawn was still being held in the books, as if it remained in the fund, and compound interest was being calculated on the total sum, including the portion that had already been taken out, which meant that every year, Valenti Corporation was paying interest on money that no longer existed. Clara saw the entire mechanism in 25 minutes, not because she was a genius, but because she had once seen something similar on a much smaller scale in her father's ranch books. Those fees that attorney Langford had charged, and that she could never trace back to their source. She closed the file, placed both hands on the tabletop, and sat very still in the silent kitchen of the 47th floor, where the coffee had gone cold in her cup, and the early Chicago morning light was beginning to pour through the glass, and she knew that what she had just found would change everything. Clara didn't knock. She held 3 files tucked under her arm, walked down the marble hallway with her footsteps echoing in a steady rhythm like a metronome, pushed open the door to Nico's office, and stepped inside, as if that room belonged to her. Nico was sitting behind his desk, the phone pressed to his ear, in the middle of an unfinished sentence to someone in a low voice, whose content she couldn't quite hear. He looked up when she came in, and there was a moment on his face that Clara read very clearly. Not anger, not irritation, but the pure surprise of a man who had never had anyone walk into his office without knocking first. He said into the phone, "I'll call you back. and hung up without waiting for the other person to answer. Clara placed the 3 files on his desk, arranged them side by side, each one already open to the page she had marked. Then she said, without sitting down, without a preface, without explaining what she had read or how long she had been reading, "Victor Harlan is stealing from you." Nico said nothing. He looked at her with the kind of silence she was beginning to recognize as the way he processed information, not through questions, but through waiting. "Not the kind of stealing you're thinking of," she continued. "He doesn't withdraw cash. He doesn't write checks to himself. He designed a system where every dollar that passes through his hands leaves a piece behind, and that system looks completely legitimate if you only look at one piece at a time." She pointed to the first file. "An advisory fee of $850,000, third quarter, the hotel company." She pointed to the second file. "Same fee, same amount, same quarter, the real estate company. 2 payments for one service that happened once." Then the third file. "And this is the sophisticated part. The money he withdrew is never removed from the fund's total asset statement. It stays there on paper, and compound interest is calculated on the total, including the portion already withdrawn. Your corporation is paying interest on ghost money." Nico looked down at the 3 open files on the desk. He read the lines she had marked, his eyes moving from one file to the next, and Clara saw the exact moment he saw it, the moment the 3 separate pieces fused into a single picture on his face. "Whoever looked at your books before me was reading each company one at a time," she said. "The hotel company accountant looked at the hotel books. The real estate company accountant looked at the real estate books. Each individual set of books looks right. The error only shows itself when you put them all beside each other in the same quarter." Nico looked up. "How long did it take you to see this?" 25 minutes. She said it not because she wanted to impress him, but because it was true. "It should have been faster, but your record system is a mess. Whoever organizes your files needs to be fired." Nico didn't laugh, but he didn't argue either. He stood up slowly, pushed his chair back without making a sound, and walked to the glass window overlooking the city. His back was turned to her. Chicago spread out 47 floors below, millions of lights coming alive in the early morning glow, and Nico Valenti stood there looking at his empire as if he had just discovered it had been hollowed out from the inside by termites. "My father trusted Harlan like a brother," he said, his voice not breaking, but thinner than she had ever heard it. "More than 20 years. He had dinner at our house every Sunday. He stood beside my father's coffin." Clara stayed still. She knew this wasn't the moment to say too much, but it also wasn't the moment to stay silent. "Your father wasn't stupid," she said. "Your father trusted someone. Those are 2 different things." Nico turned back, and Clara saw that his gaze had changed completely. It was no longer an unsolved equation, no longer measuring or recalibrating. This was the look of a man who had just realized that the woman standing in his office was not something he had bought. She was something he hadn't known he needed. "Harlan comes to the office every Monday," he said. "Then we have 4 days," she said. She pulled out the chair on the other side of the desk and sat down, opening the next file from the stack she had carried over from the kitchen. Nico looked at her for one more beat, then walked from the window back to the desk, sat down across from her, pulled another file toward himself, and began to read. They worked in silence. Neither of them said another word. The early morning light of Chicago moved slowly across the office floor, and 2 people sat across from each other over the dark wooden desk, reading the numbers left behind because one dead man had trusted the wrong person. 2 hours later, in the oldest real estate investment file Nico had given her, Clara turned to a page dated from 25 years earlier. Among the expense items, there was a line that read, "Whitfield Ranch, land acquisition advisory fee." Her hand stopped on the page. Her heart stopped with it. Whitfield, her father's ranch, her family name. In the books of the Valenti family, dated from a time when she was still a young child and her mother was still alive, long before the land was left entirely in her father's hands, matching the 25-year timeline, she folded the file shut, slowly, carefully, making sure Nico didn't see the page she had just read. She didn't know yet what that line meant. She didn't know where it led, but she knew she needed more information before she said anything, because Clara Whitfield didn't react with emotion. She reacted with evidence. And right now, she didn't have enough. 3 days after the morning, Clara placed the 3 files on Nico's desk. Cass Brewer knocked on the office door at 7 o'clock at night, with the face of a man carrying news he knew no one would want to hear. Harlan had called a meeting of the advisory board, not at the end of the quarter, as normally scheduled, but in 10 days. The official reason written in the summons: a reassessment of the corporation's governance structure following changes in family personnel. Changes in family personnel, meaning Nico's marriage. Cass placed a copy of the summons on the desk and left without another word, because Cass was the kind of man who knew when two people needed to be in a room without a third person present. Nico read the letter. Clara stood on the other side of the desk and watched his face as he read, watched his jaw tighten at the second sentence, watched his eyes stop on Harlan's signature at the bottom of the page. Then she asked the question she already knew the answer to before she asked it, but needed to hear him say out loud. "Who in town knows you got married?" Nico set the letter down. "I mentioned it to Langford, the lawyer handling the ranch paperwork for you in Montana. I needed him to prepare the land insurance transfer documents once the debt was paid." Silence. Not the comfortable kind of silence they had begun to grow used to during their first week working together. This was a heavy silence, the kind that falls when the final piece of a puzzle drops into place, and the picture it creates is uglier than you thought. Clara understood at once. Langford, the lawyer in that small Montana town whom her father had used, whom she had used, the man who had handled every piece of ranch paperwork for all those years, the fees she could never trace to their source, the documents she hadn't requested but he had filed anyway. Langford wasn't a bad lawyer. Langford was Harlan's man. He had always been Harlan's man. And Nico had told him there was a new wife, a wife with a finance degree, a wife with a handwritten clause giving her access to the corporation's books, and Langford had picked up the phone and called his real master. "That's why Harlan called the meeting early," Clara said. "Not a question. He knows someone is looking into the books, and he wants to slam the lid shut before that person can see the bottom." Nico looked at her. "How long do you need?" Clara calculated in her head. She had the mechanism. She had the evidence of duplicate fees from 2 subsidiaries, but one set of faulty books in one corporation was something Harlan's lawyers would call an administrative error, and the story would end there. She needed more. She needed a pattern. "Long enough that Harlan can't deny it?" she said. 10 days. "You have 10 days." He didn't say it like he was granting her a favor. He said it like he was confirming a fact. And Clara noted that Nico Valenti didn't ask what she was going to do in those 10 days. Didn't ask whether she was sure, didn't offer help in the way men often offered help, when what they really wanted was control. He said, "You have 10 days, and let her decide for herself what those 10 days would look like." The next day, Clara asked to see the Valenti empire with her own eyes, not just through numbers. Cass drove her all over Chicago for an entire day. The Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park, packed at noon, a line of people waiting out on the sidewalk, staff moving without pause, the bar full of customers from 11 o'clock in the morning. She looked at that restaurant and saw a business making money. Then she opened the books on her laptop in the back seat of the car and saw that the restaurant had recorded a net loss for 2 consecutive quarters. The boutique hotel in River North, 32 rooms, with an occupancy rate she estimated by counting the cars out front and the number of towels on the laundry service line in the back courtyard at no less than 80%. The books recorded revenue lower than a 2-star motel in the suburbs. She looked at 3 more properties that day, and every place told the same story. Alive in reality, dead on paper. The Valenti empire wasn't collapsing because it was weak. It was collapsing because someone had sat at the accounting table for 20 years and carefully designed it to look weak on every sheet of paper any creditor or auditor or board member might look at. On the ride back to the penthouse that afternoon, Cass looked at her through the rearview mirror and, for the first time, said a sentence longer than 3 words without anyone asking him to speak. Mr. Valenti's father was a good man. Clara looked back at him through the mirror. "I know," she said, and she truly did know, because bad people weren't deceived this way. Only good people were deceived through trust. That evening, after she saved the photograph of the ranch into a separate folder on her laptop, Clara didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the cup of tea Nico had set down for her earlier, now gone cold, and opened the public real estate registry website for the state of Montana. She typed in the county name, selected agricultural land sale transactions from the most recent 10 years, and began filtering. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was looking for a pattern, and the pattern appeared before midnight. 3 ranches within 50 miles of her father's ranch had been sold below market value over the past 10 years. Jennings Ranch sold 3 years earlier, for a price equal to 60% of its appraised value. Ashford Ranch sold 7 years earlier, for half its value. The third ranch, owned by a family named Morrison, sold 5 years earlier at the same ratio. All three had been sold to the same buyer, a limited liability company named Great Basin Land Holdings, registered in Delaware, the kind of limited liability company people formed when they didn't want anyone to know who stood behind it. Clara spent another 40 minutes, tracing it back through 3 layers of parent companies, and at the third layer, she saw a name she had already memorized: Victor Harlan. He wasn't only stealing money from the Valenti Empire, he was using that money to buy farmland in Montana through ranches he himself had strangled, with false fees and fake interest, until the owners had no choice left but to sell at a loss. Clara stared at the laptop screen in the dark kitchen, and for the first time, she understood that what had happened to her father's ranch wasn't bad luck. It was a system. The next morning, she called Walt Jennings. Walt was an old neighbor of the Whitfield family, the man Clara remembered, because he used to bring a stallion over for her father to borrow every spring, and never took a dime for it. Walt had lost his ranch 3 years earlier, sold it to a company whose name he had never heard for a price his wife cried over for an entire week, because she knew it was below the true value, but the bank hadn't left them any other choice. Clara asked Walt if he still had the papers. Walt said no. His wife, Mrs. Jennings, said yes. She had kept everything in a shoebox under the closet because she had told Walt that one day somebody would need to look back, and Walt wasn't allowed to throw away so much as a single sheet. Clara arranged to meet Walt at a small diner on the outskirts of their hometown in Montana, far enough away that no one in Nico's circle would see them, and ordinary enough for 2 Montana farmers to sit drinking coffee without anyone wondering why. Walt brought the shoebox with him. He set it on the table between 2 cups of coffee, with the face of a man who had been fooled by hope before, and was being careful not to let it fool him again. Clara opened the box. Inside were invoices, loan contracts, advisory fee receipts, and bank letters. She read every sheet, and she found it in less than 20 minutes. An advisory fee recorded in 2 different categories in the same quarter, the same amount, the same recipient. Duplicate fees, compound interest calculated on money that had already been withdrawn. The same mechanism she had found in the Valenti books, but applied to a horse ranch instead of a hotel corporation. A different year, a different ranch, the same hand. Clara looked at Walt. "Have you ever shown these papers to anyone?" Walt nodded. "Langford, the lawyer in town. He said there wasn't anything unusual." Clara didn't say anything about Langford. Not yet. She asked Walt if he knew the Ashford family. Walt knew them. Everyone in that county knew the Ashfords. Mr. Ashford had died 8 years earlier, 1 year after selling the ranch, and his wife always said he died from losing the land, not from illness. Clara called Delia Ashford from the diner parking lot. Delia's voice on the other end of the line was the voice of a 68-year-old woman who had grown used to no one calling and wasn't surprised when someone finally did. Clara said she needed to see her husband's old papers. Delia said, "Come here." Clara flew back to Montana that afternoon. Delia Ashford lived in a small house on the edge of town. Clean, quiet, the kind of house belonging to someone who had lived alone long enough that she no longer needed to explain to anyone why. She led Clara into the bedroom, knelt down, pulled a round tin box from beneath the bed, the kind of Christmas cookie tin people kept to store things, and opened the lid. Inside were yellowed papers, carefully stacked, each sheet pressed flat by her hands. Her husband's papers. 25 years earlier. Clara read them, and she saw it immediately. Duplicate fees, compound interest on ghost money, the same mechanism, the same structure, dating back 25 years to when her mother was still working in Chicago, making this the earliest record of Harlan's deception. This was the original. This was where Harlan had practiced before applying it to the Valenti Empire. Delia watched Clara fold the papers shut. "You found it, didn't you?" she said, not as a question. "You kept these for 25 years, Clara said. "I kept them because I knew one day somebody would come asking. My husband said I was crazy, but my husband also said Langford was a decent lawyer, so I didn't listen to him about this." Clara flew back to Chicago that night with Delia's tin box in her carry-on bag. 3 families, 1 method, 25 years. And she knew that Harlan could call 1 wrong set of books a dispute, but 3 wrong sets of books with the exact same mechanism, the same hand, spread across 3 families in 2 different states, couldn't be called a coincidence by anyone in the world. It was a system, and a system needed systematic evidence to bring it down. Clara finished the parallel spreadsheet on the afternoon of the 8th day, sitting at the penthouse kitchen table, with 3 spreadsheet windows open on her laptop. Column 1. What Victor Harlan had declared in the books over 25 years. Column 2. What had actually happened, based on original documents from Valenti Corporation, Walt Jennings's shoebox, and Delia Ashford's tin box. Column 3. The difference. She scrolled down to the final line of column 3 and looked at the total. More than $23 million. 25 years, 3 families, 1 corporation. She looked at that number longer than necessary. Not because she didn't believe it, but because she needed to let it sink into the right place in her mind, the place where anger couldn't interfere with accuracy. Then she closed the laptop, carried it into Nico's office, and presented everything. She spoke for 12 minutes without stopping. Nico sat and listened without asking a single question until she finished. When she stopped, he looked at the spreadsheet on the screen, looked at the stack of original documents she had arranged on the desk in chronological order, and nodded once. He didn't say, "Well done." He didn't say, "Thank you." He only nodded, the kind of nod a man gave when he had just received what he needed and was already moving to the next step in his mind. Clara returned to her room at 11 o'clock that night, changed into her sleep clothes, and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling in the dark. She couldn't sleep. Not because of the number 23 million, because of the photograph of the ranch on her phone that she still hadn't told Nico about, because of the words, Whitfield Ranch in the books, from 25 years earlier that she still didn't fully understand, because of the feeling she had no name for, the feeling that she was pulling at one thread of a ball of yarn, and that ball was much larger than anything she could see. She was thinking about that when she heard glass break, not the sound of a glass falling or wind slamming a window. This was glass breaking on purpose, one sharp, clean crack, followed by the sound of shards falling onto a hard floor, coming from the lower level of the penthouse, where Clara knew the recreation room and gym were, though she had never stepped inside either one. She sat up in bed. She didn't turn on the light. She sat in the dark and listened. Footsteps. 2 people. Soft shoes on the wooden floor, the kind chosen so they wouldn't make noise, though they still made a faint sound because no one could walk across wood in perfect silence. They were coming up the stairs. Clara got out of bed, moved barefoot across the cold floor, and picked up the brass base of the table lamp from the nightstand. It was heavy enough to hurt someone if she swung it the right way. She stood in the corner of the room beside the door, in the dark, and waited. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. Then Cass Brewer's voice came. Not loud but clear enough. Calm with the kind of calm that belonged to a man doing something he had done many times before. "Stand still. Hands up. Now." A brief scuffle. The sound of someone hitting the wall. Then silence. 30 seconds later, Clara's bedroom door opened, and Nico Valenti stood there, half his face caught between light and shadow because of the hallway light behind him. He looked into the dark room, saw the empty bed, and Clara saw something on his face she had never seen before. Fear. Not fear of the intruders. Fear of the empty bed. "I'm here," she said from the corner of the room. Nico turned toward her voice. His eyes adjusted in the dark, and she knew he saw her because something on his face changed. The fear disappeared, but what replaced it wasn't relief. It was closer to astonishment. She was standing in the corner of the room, barefoot, frighteningly calm, holding the brass lamp base raised level with her shoulder, in the posture of someone who wasn't panicking, but waiting. "Cass caught 2 people," Nico said. "Professional gear. No lethal weapons. Lock-picking tools, an external hard drive, gloves. They came for the evidence, not to hurt anyone." "Harlan's people," Clara said, not as a question. "He's a white-collar man. He hires thieves, not killers." "They targeted your room," Nico said. "Specifically the laptop." Clara lowered the lamp base and set it back on the nightstand gently, as if putting a tool back in its proper place after use. "The laptop is in the safe in your room," she said. "I moved it there 3 days ago." Silence. Nico looked at her in the darkness of the bedroom with a look she was beginning to understand was not calculation, or assessment, or recalibration. This was the look of a man realizing that the woman he had signed a contract to bring into his life was standing in front of him with a table lamp base in her hand and 3 steps already planned ahead, while he had run from the other end of the hallway because he thought she was in danger. "You knew this would happen?" he asked. "I knew that when you corner an animal, it bites," she said. And Harlan has been cornered since the moment I started opening the books. The morning after the break-in, Nico sat across from Clara at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched, and spoke in the voice she recognized as the voice he used when he had already made up his mind before speaking, not when he was asking for an opinion. I want you to move to the room beside mine, at the end of the west hallway. Closer, in case something happens. Clara looked at him over her coffee cup. I'm not moving rooms because I'm afraid. This isn't about fear. This is about practicality. The practical fact is that I'm in my room. The books I'm working on are at this kitchen table. And last night I was the only person in this penthouse who was prepared for what happened. I don't need to move rooms. I need Harlan to change tactics. Nico looked at her the way he looked when she said something he disagreed with but couldn't find a flaw in to argue against. He drank his coffee, stood up, and left the table without another word. Clara considered the matter finished. But that night, when the penthouse had gone dark and silent, she lay on the bed in her room, staring at the ceiling, and thought about the sound of breaking glass at midnight. Not because she was afraid. She wasn't afraid. But she thought about the laptop in the safe in Nico's room, and about the stack of original documents from Walt and Delia still sitting in the filing cabinet in his office. And she thought that if there was a second night, the intruders wouldn't target her room again because the first attempt had failed. They would target the office, and the office was in the west hallway. She lay there for another 10 minutes. Then she sat up, took her pillow, walked down the hallway in the dark, and lay down on the leather sofa in Nico's office. The room smelled of paper, and the cologne she had grown used to smelling every morning when he passed through the kitchen. That warm wood scent whose name she never asked, because asking the name of the cologne worn by the man she had signed a marriage contract with would cross a line she wasn't ready to cross. She pulled the thin blanket from the back of the sofa, covered herself with it, and looked at the stack of files on his desk and the city light spilling through the glass. If Nico knew she was there, he didn't say so. If he heard her footsteps crossing the hallway at midnight, he didn't come out to check. She told herself she was lying there because the records were there. They both knew that wasn't the only reason. Early morning, Clara was washing her face in the small bathroom attached to the office. The door opened because she wasn't in the habit of closing the bathroom door when she was only washing her face. A habit from the ranch where she had lived alone for 18 months, and there had been no one she needed to close the door for. She was cupping water up to her face when she heard Nico's footsteps passing down the hallway, the steady morning steps whose rhythm she had memorized, and those steps stopped. She looked up, her face wet, her hands braced on either side of the sink, and saw Nico standing in the bathroom doorway. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her wrist, her left wrist, the place where, the night before, she had gripped the brass base of the table lamp too tightly while standing in the dark corner of her room, waiting for whoever might open the door, gripping it so tightly that the brass had pressed into her skin and left a bruise the length of 2 knuckles, dark purple, clear against the pale skin of her wrist. Nico stepped into the bathroom. He didn't ask. He didn't say, "Let me see." He took her left wrist in both hands, so gently Clara almost thought he was holding something breakable, and turned her wrist to look at the bruise under the light. His hands were warm, dry, with calluses in the palms that she hadn't expected from a man who wore suits every day, and he held her hand in a way Clara recognized as the way of a man used to using his hands to cause pain, but right now, trying very hard not to cause any. His thumb rested just below the bruise, not touching it, only a layer of skin away, and he held it there. "You should have let Cass handle it," he said, his voice low, close. The distance between them in that small bathroom shorter than any distance they had shared in the past 2 weeks. "Whoever is closest handles it," she said. He didn't let go of her hand. She didn't pull it back. And in that moment, standing in the small bathroom attached to the office on the 47th floor, at 5 o'clock in the morning in Chicago, her face still wet, his hand still holding her wrist, neither of them said anything more, because there was no right word for what was happening between 2 people who hadn't invited it in and didn't know what to call it. That moment lasted 3 breaths, or 4, or 10. Clara didn't count because she was busy feeling the weight of his hand on her wrist, absurdly gentle for a man the world called ruthless. Then she pulled her hand back, not sharply, not quickly, at her own pace, the same pace at which she had done everything since the day she stepped onto the porch of the Montana ranch and read the contract for the first time. Nico walked out of the bathroom without saying another word. Clara heard his footsteps move down the hallway, growing farther away, steady and even, and she stood there alone with her left wrist still warm where he had just held it, looking into the mirror, looking at her wet face, and at eyes that were telling her something she wasn't ready to hear. Clara flew back to Montana the next day without telling Nico the real reason. She said she needed to get her father's ranch books so she could compare the Whitfield Ranch land acquisition advisory fee in the Valenti records against any matching entry in her father's accounts. That was true, but it wasn't everything. She needed to stand inside the house where she had grown up, alone, without Nico, without Cass, without anyone else's books except her family's, and she needed to understand why the name of her father's ranch had appeared in the books of a Chicago Mafia family 25 years before she signed a marriage contract with the head of that family. The plane landed in Bozeman at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She rented a car and drove 2 hours back to town, along roads she could have driven with her eyes closed because she had been driving them since she was 16. And when she turned onto the dirt road leading to the ranch, Montana autumn was at its peak, the western mountains capped with white snow, while their lower slopes still burned gold with leaves, the air thin and sharp as a blade, and the ranch appeared at the end of the road in the late afternoon light, beautiful in a breath-stealing way that only places you have lost can be beautiful. She parked in front of the porch, stepped onto the wooden stairs her mother had painted white, sat in the exact spot where she had sat when Cass Brewer came to deliver the leather envelope, and stayed there for 1 minute, looking across the yard before she went inside. The house was cold because no one had turned on the heater for weeks. It smelled of old wood and paper and the faint trace of the medicine her father had taken in his final months. Clara went straight to her father's office at the end of the first-floor hallway. It was a small room, with the oak desk her father had used since before she was born, a swivel chair with worn fabric on both arms, a small bookshelf filled with books about livestock and land management, and 4 framed photographs on the wall. Her parents' wedding photo, a photo of Clara at 5 years old sitting on a horse for the first time, her mother standing beside her holding the reins, smiling, a photo of her father standing in front of the newly built horse barn, straw hat on his head, his face sun-browned and proud, and a photo of the family of 3, taken on the front porch, the last picture of all 3 of them before her mother got sick. Clara didn't look at the photographs for long. She went to the safe. It was a small safe tucked under the desk, the kind Montana farmers use to keep land papers and a handgun, with a combination lock whose code was her birthday because her father never chose any other kind of password. She opened it. Inside were 2 thick ledgers, hard-covered in dark blue, her father's handwriting on the cover reading, "Ranch accounts with the year." The ranch books. She took them out, opened them, and turned through the pages. Her father's handwriting, slanting to the right, careful in the way of someone who wasn't used to writing much but tried to make every word clear. Income, expenses, livestock sales and purchases, repair fees, property taxes, ordinary. Then she looked down at the bottom of the safe and saw the 3rd book, smaller than the other 2, brown leather cover, darkened with age, with nothing written on the front. She picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. She opened the first page, and everything inside her stopped. The handwriting on the first page wasn't her father's. She knew her father's handwriting the way she knew her own face in the mirror. This wasn't his. This handwriting was smaller, neater, slanting left instead of right, and she knew whose it was before her eyes had even finished reading the first line, because she had seen this handwriting on the backs of family photographs, on an old shopping list, still tucked inside a cookbook in the kitchen, on the final birthday card she had ever received from her mother. Her mother's handwriting. Ruth Whitfield. Clara sat down on the floor of her father's office, her back against the leg of the desk, and began to read. Her mother had written this notebook. 25 years earlier, before Montana, before her father, before Clara, Ruth had worked as an accountant for a financial management company in Chicago called Lakefront Capital Services. That company, according to what Ruth had written in the notebook, was one of the Valenti family's first legal fronts, used to move money from operations that couldn't be declared into the official financial system. Ruth didn't write those things in a frightened voice. She wrote them in the voice of an accountant, precise, methodical, line by line, number by number, name by name, date by date. She had seen the unusual cash flow. She had traced it backward. She had understood what she was looking at, and she had recorded all of it. Not because she intended to report anyone, but because she was the kind of person who couldn't see a wrong number without writing the right one beside it. Then she quit. No report, no threat, no word to anyone, She knew what she was looking at, and she knew the price of opening your mouth when you were a woman in your 20s with a small child, working for people whose witnesses had a habit of withdrawing their testimony. She took her child, left Chicago, came to Montana, met Henry Whitfield at a livestock fair, married him, and buried the notebook in a safe he never opened because he trusted his wife and didn't ask about the things she didn't tell him. Clara turned to the final pages. Her mother's handwriting was different here. Still neat, but more unsteady. The ink strokes thinner, the handwriting of someone writing when her body was no longer cooperating. The date in the corner of the page. 6 months before her mother died. Clara read the final line, and she had to read it twice because the first time, tears blurred the words. Books don't know how to lie, my daughter. People do. Clara closed the notebook, pressed it to her chest, and cried. She cried, sitting on the cold wooden floor of her father's office, her back against the leg of the desk where her father had sat on thousands of mornings, beneath 4 family photographs, where she was now the only one still alive. And she cried not because she was afraid, not because she was angry, but because for the first time she understood that when her father said, "Everything I'm leaving you is in there," he hadn't been talking about memories. He had known the notebook was there. He didn't know what was written inside, because he hadn't opened it. But he knew his wife had buried something in that safe before she died, and he had kept it for his daughter because that was the last thing he could do for the woman he loved most, and the woman he loved second most. Clara cried until there were no tears left, then wiped her face with her sleeve, stood up, took the brown leather notebook, put it in her handbag, and drove to the airport. Clara returned to the penthouse close to midnight. Nico was sitting in the office, the desk lamp on, files open in front of him, but his eyes were not on the files. He was looking at the door. He was waiting for her. She didn't know how long he had been waiting, and she didn't ask. She walked straight into the office, placed the brown leather notebook on the desk between them, and sat down in the chair across from him. She said nothing. Nico looked at the notebook, looked at her, looked back at the notebook. He recognized that this was not something she had taken with her when she left Chicago that morning, and he recognized from her face that whatever was inside this notebook weighed more than any spreadsheet she had presented to him before. He pulled the notebook toward himself, opened the first page, and began to read. Clara sat still. She didn't explain, she didn't summarize. She let him read at his own pace, because this was a story he needed to see for himself. Line by line, number by number, each stroke of handwriting left by a woman who had passed away when Clara was still a young girl, but had left behind evidence more precise than any living lawyer. Nico read slowly. He turned one page at a time, his finger moving along the rows of numbers in a way Clara recognized as the reading habit of someone cross-checking things in his head, comparing what Ruth had written with what he knew about his own corporation 25 years earlier, when he was not yet 12 years old. He didn't ask who had written the notebook. The handwriting on the first page said clearly, Ruth Whitfield. He had read the Whitfield name enough times over the past few weeks to know it was his mother-in-law's name. The office was completely silent. There was only the sound of paper turning, and the sound of the city 47 floors below, distant and blurred like ocean waves heard from inland. Nico read through the section Ruth had written about Lakefront Capital Services without changing expression. He read the section Ruth had written about the money transfer mechanism without changing expression. He read the part where Ruth wrote why she quit and left Chicago, and his jaw tightened, but his face remained flat. Then he turned to the final pages written in Chicago, the ones her mother had compiled in secret just before fleeing the city, containing the ultimate truth about the Valenti family's past. Ruth had recorded it in detail. A large payment from a fund managed by Victor Harlan, transferred to Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, listed under the purpose, medical expenses. Beside it, Ruth had written, "This payment is declared as personally paid by V. Harlan, but the source of the funds traces back to Mr. Valenti Sr.'s personal account, not to any account under Harlan's name." Nico stopped on that line. Clara saw his eyes read that line a second time, then a third. Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Medical expenses. His father's personal account. She knew he was putting it together. Nico's mother had been hospitalized at Northwestern Memorial before she died. Nico's father had told his son, maybe many times, maybe during Sunday dinners when Harlan sat at the same table, that Harlan had paid Nico's mother's hospital bills when the family was struggling, that Harlan was a benefactor, that without Harlan, Nico's mother wouldn't have received treatment in her final months. And Nico's father had owed Harlan from that moment on. Owed him so deeply that he never questioned any number Harlan presented. Owed him so deeply that he signed the family agreement appointing Harlan as chairman of the advisory board without reading it closely. Owed him so deeply that he died still believing Harlan had saved his wife. But Ruth Whitfield, a young accountant in Chicago 25 years earlier, had seen the truth. Harlan hadn't paid a single dollar. He had taken Nico's father's money from Nico's father's own personal account, transferred it to the hospital, then recorded it as if Harlan had paid. He had used Nico's father's own money to buy Nico's father's gratitude. And that gratitude became a shield no one could pierce for more than 20 years. Nico closed the notebook, slowly, both hands flat on the brown leather cover, all 10 fingers stretched straight, as if he were trying to keep the desk from shaking. He said nothing. He looked down at the cover of the notebook, then he lowered his head, and his shoulders shook. No sound, not audible crying, just his shoulders shaking, lightly, steadily, the tremor of a person holding everything inside, while his body refused to hold the last piece. Clara sat across from him. She didn't get up and walk around to his side. She didn't put a hand on his shoulder. She didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't okay. And she respected him enough not to lie to him with cheap comfort. She sat still, both hands on the table, and she stayed there. Because Clara had learned, from 18 months sitting beside her father's bed in the back room of the Montana ranch, that there were kinds of pain no words could heal, and no one needed you to heal them. They only needed you to be there, to witness, not to look away, not to fill the silence with meaningless words, just to be there. Nico lifted his head after how long? Clara didn't count. His eyes were red but dry. His voice was calm in a way she recognized was not true calm, but calm rebuilt from rubble, the kind of calm people constructed when they needed to stay standing long enough to finish what still had to be done, before allowing themselves to fall. "When does Harlan arrive?" he asked. 4 days, she said. "Then we finish in 4 days." He pulled the parallel spreadsheet Clara had built toward himself, opened the laptop, and began to work. Clara opened her mother's notebook to the page she needed to cross-check next, and she began to work too. The two of them sat across from each other at the desk in the office on the 47th floor at 1 o'clock in the morning, one person having just lost his father a second time after discovering that the gratitude his father carried all the way to the grave had been false, and one person having just found her mother again in trembling lines of ink on yellowed paper. And neither of them said another word because they didn't need to. The night before Harlan was due to arrive, Clara stayed at Valenti Corporation headquarters on Wacker Avenue by herself until 2 o'clock in the morning. She had told Nico to go home. He looked at her with the look she had learned meant, "I don't like this, but I trust you enough not to stop you." And he left. Cass stayed in the car in the basement garage, not because she asked him to, but because Cass never asked whether he was needed or not. He was simply there. Clara stood in the main conference room on the 32nd floor, a long room with a dark wooden table large enough for 16 people, glass walls overlooking the Chicago River, and she began arranging things. She placed the parallel spreadsheet at the exact center of the table, in the central position where anyone seated at the table couldn't avoid seeing it. The files from Walt Jennings and Delia Ashford she stacked on the left side, face down, waiting for the right moment. Her mother's brown leather notebook she placed on the right, also face down. She adjusted the blinds so the morning light would fall directly onto Harlan's seat without shining into her face or Nico's. She pulled Nico's chair back from the table at exactly the distance that would let him sit comfortably against the backrest while still looking straight into Harlan's face. Her own chair she placed beside Nico's, slightly forward, because she would be the one speaking, and she wanted Harlan to have to look at her when she presented, not look past her in search of Nico. Arranging a room for a difficult conversation wasn't a small thing. It was the first sentence you spoke to the other person before you ever opened your mouth. It told them they were not walking into an improvised conversation. They were walking into something that had been prepared, and the person who prepared it knew exactly what she wanted from this room before they sat down. Clara left the headquarters at 2:25 in the morning. 6 hours later, she stood beside Nico in the hallway of the 32nd floor when the elevator opened, and Victor Harlan stepped out, 61 years old. Silver hair cut neatly, the expensive kind of haircut belonging to a man who had it trimmed every 2 weeks. A light gray 3-piece suit that Clara estimated cost as much as 2 months of payments on her old ranch debt. Polished shoes. His face was the face of a man who had learned how to arrange it into whatever expression the room required. And right now it had been arranged into polite, confident, slightly busy, ready to end this quickly. Behind him came a younger man carrying a leather briefcase, with the look of a lawyer paid to be present, not to have an opinion. Harlan shook Nico's hand with a handshake. Clara read immediately. The handshake of a man counting down the time until he owned what the other hand was still holding. Then his eyes moved to Clara. Once, quickly, from her face down to her clothes, down to her jewelryless hand, then back to her face, then over to Nico. He had classified her in less than 2 seconds. Young wife, decoration, irrelevant. Clara noted that, and filed it in the box marked advantage in her mind. They entered the conference room. Harlan looked at the table, at the face-down files, at the spreadsheet in the center, and Clara saw something very small change on his face. Not concern, only recalculation. The slight adjustment of a man stepping into a room where the light was not where he expected it to be. The first cause. He sat in the chair Clara had chosen for him without knowing it had been chosen. The lawyer sat behind him and opened the leather briefcase. Nico sat down. Clara sat beside Nico, slightly forward. Harlan opened the folder he had brought with him, set it on the table with the confidence of a man who had never been asked a question he didn't already have an answer for, and said, "Good. We should begin with last quarter's numbers. I have a few adjustments to discuss regarding the management fee structure and—" "Before we get to your numbers," Clara said, and she said it in a flat voice, no louder than Harlan's, without any special emphasis, but she said it into the exact space between his 2 words, the way a thin knife slipped into the crack of a door, without force, only precision. "I'd like to get to ours." The conference room fell silent after Clara spoke. Harlan looked at her for the second time since he had stepped into the room, and this time, he looked for longer than 2 seconds. Clara didn't wait for him to react. She opened the parallel spreadsheet in the middle of the table, turned it toward Harlan, and began to speak. She started with the numbers Harlan couldn't dispute, because they were his own numbers. The original investment from the advisory fund into Valenti Corporation, the agreed interest rate, the payment schedule for the first 2 years. She read each number slowly, precisely, and every time she finished reading one, she paused and looked at Harlan, not to challenge him, but to give him the chance to nod, confirm, agree, and he nodded. The first time, the second time, the third time. He nodded because those numbers were correct, because they were the numbers he had confidently presented for 20 years, and he saw no reason not to nod. She was building the foundation. She was creating a patch of ground both sides were standing on, both sides agreeing that the ground here was solid, and once the foundation had been built, once Harlan had nodded enough times that he couldn't turn around and say the numbers had been wrong from the beginning, Clara moved to the 3rd year. An advisory fee of $850,000, 3rd quarter, recorded at the hotel company. The same fee, the same amount, the same quarter, recorded at the real estate company. She placed the 2 pages side by side on the dark wooden table, turning them so Harlan could see both at once. "This is an administrative error," Harlan said. His voice didn't change. His face didn't change. He said it with the confidence of a man who had prepared an answer to this question long ago, because he had known that someday someone might ask, and he had practiced the answer until it sounded like truth. Clara didn't argue. She turned over the face-down file on the left. Walt Jennings's papers. She opened to the page she had marked. Jennings Ranch, 3 years ago. An advisory fee recorded in 2 categories in the same quarter. Same amount, same mechanism. She placed that page beside the first 2. Also an administrative error? Harlan didn't nod this time. He looked at Walt Jennings's papers with the expression of a man who had just realized that what he was looking at shouldn't be in this room. She opened the next file. Delia Ashford's papers, 25 years ago. The same mechanism. The same duplicate fee. The same interest calculated on money that had already been withdrawn. Clara arranged all of it side by side on the table. 3 sets of documents from 3 different families, 3 different periods of time, and she said, 3 families. 1 method. 25 years. That isn't an administrative error, Mr. Harlan. That's a system. The silence in the conference room grew so heavy, Clara could hear the clock on the wall. Harlan looked from the papers on the table to Nico, then to the lawyer behind him, then back to Clara. And when he turned back to Clara, something in his carefully arranged face cracked. Not much, only enough for her to see the real person behind the mask, and that real person was angry. "You have no standing in this matter," he said, and this was the first time his voice had an edge. "You are a horse girl from Montana who was bought to sign a marriage certificate. You know nothing about how this corporation operates. You know nothing about this family's history, and you certainly have no right to sit here and present me with papers you dug up from God knows where." Nico shifted forward in his chair. Only slightly, 2 or 3 centimeters. But Clara felt the air in the room change, as if someone had just opened a window in the middle of winter. And she knew that everyone in the room, Harlan, the lawyer, Cass standing by the door, felt it too. Clara didn't need Nico to move another centimeter. She didn't need anyone to protect her. She looked straight into Victor Harlan's eyes and said, "My standing. I'm Nico Valenti's legal wife. I'm the person who compiled the entire evidence file you're looking at on this table. And I'm the daughter of Ruth Whitfield." She turned over the brown leather notebook face down on the right and placed it directly in front of Harlan. His face changed, truly changed for the first time. Not anger, not defense. This was the face of a man who had just seen something he had been certain would never appear in any room he sat in. He knew what that notebook was. He knew the name Ruth Whitfield, and he knew, looking into Clara's eyes, that she had read all of it. "My mother recorded the hospital payment you claimed you made to Northwestern Memorial Hospital," Clara said. "That money came from Nico's father's personal account, not from you. You used his own money to buy his gratitude, and that gratitude gave you 20 years without anyone asking questions." Clara paused for one beat. The complete file, 3 families, 25 years, including my mother's notes and the hospital payment, was sent to the FBI Chicago field office 2 days ago. Silence. Harlan looked at Nico. "You brought the FBI into family business?" Nico looked back at him. His gaze was flat, neither hot nor cold, the gaze of a man who had already made his decision before this meeting began. "You aren't family," Nico said. "You never were." Harlan stood. The lawyer behind him stood faster, packing papers into the leather briefcase with hands that Clara could see trembling from her side of the table. Harlan walked to the door without looking back, without shaking hands, without saying another word, and Clara listened to his footsteps in the hallway, faster than when he had arrived, the sound of polished shoes on marble, then the sound of the elevator closing. The conference room was empty. The papers were still spread across the table. Her mother's notebook still lay open to the final page. Cass closed the conference room door from the outside without anyone needing to tell him. Clara and Nico remained seated in the empty room. The papers still spread across the table, and the Chicago morning light had shifted from the position she had planned for Harlan to the middle of the table, falling across the parallel spreadsheet no one was looking at. Nico stayed silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice flat. But Clara could hear something beneath that flatness. Something she had never heard in Nico Valenti before. Being caught off guard. "You sent it to the FBI without telling me. It wasn't a question. Clara didn't treat it like one." "Because you wouldn't have agreed," she said. "And if Harlan had looked into your eyes today and seen that you already knew, it would have shown on your face. You're good at hiding many things, but you're not good at hiding when you've already made up your mind. I needed Harlan to believe you were hearing all of it for the first time at the same moment he was." Nico looked at her. This look wasn't an equation, wasn't recalibration, wasn't the wrist look from 5 o'clock in the morning in the bathroom. This was the look of a man who had just realized the person sitting across from him had calculated 2 steps ahead of him, and he didn't know whether he should be angry or grateful. "You're managing me," he said. "I'm managing the situation," she said. "You're part of the situation." Silence. Heavier than any silence between them before. Heavier than the night he stood in her doorway after the break-in. Heavier than the morning in the bathroom, because this wasn't silence between 2 people avoiding naming something. This was silence between 2 people deciding whether they still trusted each other after one of them had acted behind the other's back, because it was right. "The FBI won't only look at Harlan," Nico said, his voice very quiet. "You know that, don't you? They'll look at everything. The books, the companies, the cash flow, everything this family has done for 30 years. I know. And you still sent it, because you said you wanted to make it legitimate." She looked straight at him, not looking away, not softening it. "This is the price of legitimacy. Light shines into every corner, not only the corners you choose." The longest silence in their entire story. Clara didn't know how long it lasted because she wasn't counting. She was looking at Nico's face and waiting, not waiting for him to agree, but waiting to see what kind of man he was when placed somewhere he couldn't control the outcome. Then Nico nodded. Once, slowly. That nod wasn't like any nod she had ever seen from him before. Not a nod confirming a number. Not a nod giving her permission to read a file. This was the nod of a man giving up control over something he had controlled his entire life. And he was giving it up because the woman sitting across from him was right, and he knew she was right, even though he hated that she was right. It was the most expensive nod of Nico Valenti's life. 3 months later, Victor Harlan was indicted by the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. 3 counts: financial fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. The evidence included the parallel spreadsheet Clara had built, original records from 3 families, and Ruth Whitfield's brown leather notebook. Frank Langford was disbarred by the State Bar of Montana for ethical violations and conflicts of interest. Walt Jennings received compensation from the parallel civil lawsuit, enough to buy back a portion of the old ranch land his wife had cried over for an entire week when they lost it. Delia Ashford was invited to testify in federal court. She wore her best outfit, brought the Christmas cookie tin with her, and when the prosecutor asked why she had kept the papers for 25 years, she said, "I waited 25 years for somebody to ask." The Valenti family came under federal investigation. Nico cooperated fully. He opened every book, every account, every door the FBI wanted opened, and he did it not because Clara forced him to, but because that nod in the conference room that day hadn't been for her. He had nodded for himself. Valenti Corporation shrank. Some operations were shut down, some people left. But what remained was clean. Clean in the way that light could shine into any corner, without anyone needing to close their eyes. One evening, 3 months and 2 weeks after the day Harlan left the conference room without shaking hands, Nico's phone rang. He looked at the screen, and Clara saw his face do something she had never seen before. Soften. He answered. Paige, his younger sister, a psychiatrist in Boston, the woman who hadn't spoken to him in 4 years because she couldn't bear the world her brother lived in. Clara heard one half of the call from across the living room. Paige's voice was small through the speaker, but Clara heard the final sentence clearly, because Nico had put her on speaker without explaining why. Maybe because he wanted Clara to hear, maybe because he needed someone to hear it with him. "My sister-in-law is really something," Paige said. Nico looked at Clara across the living room. "I know," he said. 12 months after the day Clara Whitfield signed the marriage contract on the office desk on the 47th floor in Chicago, she received compensation from the federal civil lawsuit against Victor Harlan. The Whitfield family was listed among the victims because her father's ranch had been charged phantom advisory fees through Langford for years, and the court ordered compensation for all 3 families. That money was enough for Clara to pay off the ranch debt completely without touching a single dollar from Nico Valenti. She never touched his money. Not because of pride, because of principle. The ranch belonged to her father. The ranch debt was her problem, and she would solve it with justice, not marriage. On the morning the contract expired, Clara placed a white envelope on the penthouse kitchen table, right beside the coffee pot Nico had still prepared every morning for 12 months. Inside were the divorce papers. She had already signed her part. She didn't wait for Nico to wake up. She took her handbag, stepped into the elevator, and left the glass building in the Gold Coast for the last time without looking back. The plane brought her back to Bozeman at noon. She drove 2 hours along roads where she knew every pothole, and when the ranch appeared at the end of the dirt road, she saw it before she had time to think. The fence had been painted white. The horse barn roof had been repaired. Someone had done these things while she was in Chicago, and she didn't need to ask who, because only one person knew exactly what needed fixing on this ranch, because that person had studied her life down to every penny before sending the leather envelope to her porch 12 months earlier. Clara parked the car, stepped out, and stood in the middle of the yard, looking at her ranch. In the paddock, the horse she had asked Walt Jennings to care for all year was standing in the open space, calm, head lowered as it grazed, not looking toward the fence, not testing the fence, not searching for a way out. It stood there as if it had decided this place was good enough to stay. Clara went into the house, opened the kitchen window to let the Montana autumn wind pour in, and began wiping dust from the oak table her mother had bought at a flea market. 3 days passed. 3 days of feeding horses, fixing fences, cleaning stalls, cooking alone in the quiet kitchen, and sleeping in her old bedroom without the sound of footsteps at the far end of the hallway, without the smell of coffee already brewed at 4 o'clock in the morning, without a file placed on the dining table with no explanation. 3 days of trying not to think about it, and failing all 3 days. On the afternoon of the 4th day, she was in the horse barn changing the straw when she heard a car on the dirt road. Not the sound of the 1997 Ford truck she had sold the week before. A different sound, smoother, the kind of car that didn't belong on this road. She didn't turn around. The engine shut off. A car door opened and closed. Footsteps on gravel, steady, unhurried, a rhythm she had heard in the marble hallway on the 47th floor for 12 months, and had memorized as if it were the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She still didn't turn around. The footsteps stopped at the barn door. Clara held a bundle of straw in her hands, her back to the door, and waited. "I didn't sign." Nico's voice. Not over the phone. Not through a penthouse wall. Here, in her horse barn, 800 miles from Chicago. His voice sounded different, more open, as if the Montana air had stripped away the flat layer he had laid over everything he said for all those years. Clara turned around. Nico Valenti stood in the doorway of the Montana ranch barn. Dark gray suit, no tie, sleeves rolled up, leather shoes stained with dirt road dust, and in his right hand, the white envelope she had placed on the kitchen table 3 days earlier. The divorce papers inside. She looked at the envelope, then at him. "The contract expired," she said. "I'm not talking about the contract." Silence. The Montana wind pulled through the cracks in the barn door, carrying the smell of hay and the smell of autumn nearing its end. "You saved the empire I almost lost," he said. "You found the traitor my father trusted his whole life. You sent the FBI into my house and forced me to look at every ugliest thing my family had ever touched." He stopped. "And you were the only one who stayed in the room when I couldn't hold myself together." He said the last sentence more softly than the ones before it, and Clara heard in it the same thing she had heard when he lowered his head over the brown leather notebook at 1 o'clock in the morning in Chicago, when his shoulders shook without a sound, when she sat there and didn't say "it's okay" because she respected him enough not to lie. "Stay," he said, not in the voice of a man giving an order, not the voice he had used when he said "sit down" on the first day. This was the voice of a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't planned for, couldn't control, couldn't buy or sign a contract for. And he was standing in a horse barn with dirt on his leather shoes, asking a Montana horsewoman whether she would stay. Clara looked at him, and for the first time since she had read the contract on this porch 12 months earlier, she looked at Nico Valenti not as an equation to solve, not as a situation to manage, not as a piece on a chessboard where she was calculating the next move. She looked at him as a man standing in her horse barn with Montana dust on his shoes and unsigned divorce papers in his hand, and she wanted him here. "I told you from the first day," she said. "I don't fold." He held out his hand. Not the hand helping her out of a car the way he had the first time at the penthouse. An open hand, palm turned upward, the hand of someone asking, not offering terms. Clara took his hand. At her own pace. The Montana afternoon spread October sunlight through the barn door, gold and warm across the straw-covered floor. The white envelope lay on a bale of hay in the corner of the barn, the divorce papers inside still bearing only one signature. The horse stood in the middle of the yard beyond the door, calm, no longer testing the fence. And in the small kitchen of Whitfield Ranch, on the oak table Clara's mother had bought at a flea market 20 years earlier, there were 2 cups of coffee placed side by side, one black, one with sugar, beside the closed brown leather notebook and a new ledger, its first page still blank, waiting to be written. Today's story is about Clara, about Nico, about ledgers and secrets people bury to protect the ones they love. But deeper than every plotline, this is a story about something I believe each of us needs to hear. Your worth is never measured by the money in your account or the piece of land beneath your feet. Your worth lies in what you know, what you dare to do when you're backed into a corner, and how you treat others when you have the power to treat them any way you want. Clara Whitfield walked into Nico Valenti's world with a handbag and a mind that knew how to read books. She left with her dignity intact, and that was why he came back. Trust isn't an easy thing to give, but the person who exploits trust is the one at fault, not the one who trusted. Nico's father wasn't wrong to trust Harlan. Clara's mother wasn't a coward for running. They were ordinary people, facing extraordinary choices, and they protected the people they loved in the only way they could. That is what I want every person watching this video to carry with them when they turn off the screen tonight. If this story touched you, please press the subscribe button on our channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next stories. Every day, we bring you stories we believe deserve to be told. Please like and share this video so more people can hear it. And above all, I want to hear from you. If you were in Clara's position, would you have signed that contract? Have you ever met someone in your life like Ruth, like Delia, like Walt, people who kept the truth inside a tin box under the bed and waited for the day someone would come asking? Write it in the comments. I read every comment, and I want to hear what you feel from deep in your heart. Hello to everyone who stayed until the very last minute. Thank you. I wish each of you watching this video truly good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.